This is a document signed in 1936 in Montreux, Switzerland. It is 29 articles long. It regulates the passage of warships through a strait that runs through the middle of Istanbul. It is currently the single most consequential maritime constraint on the operations of the Russian Navy. The strait is the Bosphorus, 31 kilometers long, between 700 and 750 meters wide at its narrowest, depending on which source you trust. It is the only sea route between the Black Sea and the rest of the world's oceans. The strait is Turkish sovereign water, but what Turkey can do with that sovereignty is governed by the treaty on screen. On February 27th of 2022, 3 days into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Turkey invoked Article 19 of the Montreux Convention, the treaty's wartime provision. Russian warships outside the Black Sea on that date could no longer transit through for offensive operations, though the treaty preserves a return-to-base exception for vessels homeported in the Black Sea. A treaty older than most NATO members had just become one of the most consequential maritime restrictions of the war. This episode is about how a small country has held that door for 90 years. The Turkish Straits are not one strait. They are a system of 3 connected bodies of water that together form the only sea connection between the Black Sea and the world's oceans. From north to south, ships transit the Bosphorus, 31 kilometers long, running through Istanbul. They emerge into the Sea of Marmara, a small interior sea, about 280 kilometers long. They then transit the Dardanelles, another 65 kilometers of navigable water, to reach the Aegean Sea and, beyond it, the Mediterranean. Both straits are narrow. Both are Turkish. Both are governed by the same treaty. The Bosphorus is the more famous of the two, primarily because it runs through one of the world's great cities. At its narrowest point, between fortifications known as Rumeli Hisarı on the European side and Anadolu Hisarı on the Asian side, the strait is about 700 meters wide. Some sources put the narrowest point closer to 750 meters. The maximum depth is about 110 to 124 meters. The strait makes 12 significant course changes, sharp turns that require constant maneuvering by large vessels. Strong currents flow from the Black Sea south, with a countercurrent at depth flowing north. It is one of the most challenging waterways in the world to navigate, and it carries roughly 40,000 vessel transits per year. The Black Sea, north of the Bosphorus, is effectively a cul-de-sac. Ships entering or leaving it must pass through the Bosphorus. There is no other route. Whoever controls the Bosphorus controls who can sail in and out of the Black Sea. For most of history, that has been Turkey. The Montreux Convention was negotiated in 1936 between Turkey and 10 other states: Bulgaria, Romania, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, Greece, Japan, Yugoslavia, Australia, and at the time, the Kingdom of Bulgaria. It replaced an earlier regime from the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne and reinstated Turkish sovereignty over the Straits, which had been demilitarized after the First World War. The convention has 3 core mechanics. The first is peacetime free passage for merchant ships. Any commercial vessel, under any flag, in any condition of peace or war between other states, has the right to transit the Turkish Straits. Turkey cannot charge transit fees beyond predetermined administrative and sanitary charges. This part of the convention has held essentially without dispute for 90 years. The second mechanic is the most operationally complex. Warships have a limited right of passage, but only under specific conditions that depend on whether the warship belongs to a Black Sea coastal state or a non-Black Sea state. Black Sea states, historically, Bulgaria, Romania, Soviet Union, and Turkey, today including Ukraine and Georgia, can move their warships through the straits with notification but few other restrictions. Non-Black Sea states face strict limits. Total tonnage of non-Black Sea warships present in the Black Sea at any time cannot exceed 30,000 tons. Each individual warship cannot remain in the Black Sea more than 21 days, and the Convention's Annex II effectively excludes modern aircraft carriers from the categories of warship permitted to transit by defining capital ships in a way that does not include carriers. The third mechanic is Article 19, the wartime provision. When Turkey is at war, Turkey can restrict warship passage at its discretion. When Turkey is not at war, but determines that a state of war exists between others and that war presents a security threat to Turkey, Turkey can restrict the passage of warships belonging to the warring states. There is one critical exception built into Article 19. Warships of belligerent states retain the right to return to their home base even during wartime restrictions. This is the legal lever Turkey pulled in February of 2022. On February 24th of 2022, Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. On February 27th, 3 days later, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu publicly declared that the conflict had become a war and that Turkey would apply Article 19 of the Montreux Convention. The legal effect was immediate. Russian warships outside the Black Sea on February 27th, and not transiting back to their home base, could not enter the Black Sea to support offensive operations against Ukraine. Russian warships already in the Black Sea could not leave for offensive operations outside the Black Sea unless they were returning to a home port elsewhere. The Article 19 exception preserved one specific right. A vessel home-ported in the Black Sea, for example at Sevastopol, could return to its home base after operations elsewhere, but it could not freely transit back outward for new offensive operations. Turkey's application of Article 19 was decisive and was respected by all parties. NATO members did not test the rule by attempting to transit warships through the Straits toward the conflict zone. Russia did not directly challenge the Turkish enforcement. Ukrainian appeals for additional naval support from non-Black Sea NATO partners were constrained by the same rule that constrained Russia. The Straits became, in effect, a sealed front. Naval power in the Black Sea was limited to forces already present on February 27th, supplemented only by what each side could move within the existing constraints of the treaty. Turkey is not a party to the war. Turkey is a NATO member, but has maintained working relationships with both Russia and Ukraine throughout the conflict, including hosting peace negotiation rounds and brokering grain export agreements. Turkey's enforcement of Article 19 was not a choice of sides. It was a choice of treaty. The treaty restricts belligerent warships when Turkey determines a war exists. Turkey determined a war existed. The legal mechanism worked. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, headquartered at Sevastopol, is one of Russia's 4 main fleets, alongside the Northern, Pacific, and Baltic fleets. Its strategic role for Russia is projecting naval power into the Mediterranean, a capability that, since the Russian deployment to Syria's Tartus port in 2015, had become important to Russian operations in the eastern Mediterranean. With Article 19 invoked, Russian vessels could not freely rotate through the Straits to relieve, refuel, or reinforce Mediterranean operations. Vessels outside the Black Sea at the start of the war could not return for offensive operations. Vessels in the Black Sea could not deploy outward except to home base. Russia's Mediterranean naval projection capacity, which had grown significantly since 2015, was effectively frozen at 2022 levels. Inside the Black Sea, the situation was different. Russia could continue operations against Ukraine, but the Black Sea Fleet itself sustained significant losses during the war. The Moskva, the fleet's flagship, a Slava-class missile cruiser, was sunk in April of 2022, hit by Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles. Other vessels were lost or damaged in subsequent strikes. The fleet that survived the war was a degraded version of the fleet that entered it. The Montreux constraint compounded this damage by preventing Russia from bringing in reinforcements from other fleets. Russia could neither replace lost warships from outside the Black Sea nor freely deploy what remained to support broader strategic objectives. The strategic significance of the Montreux constraint extends beyond Russia. The same Article 19 rule that limits Russian belligerent warship transit also limits warship transit by other belligerents. If, in a future conflict, NATO members were to find themselves in direct naval confrontation with Russia in the Black Sea, Article 19 would apply to them equally. The convention is symmetric. It constrains whatever party is at war, including states that might wish to use the Black Sea for offensive operations. This is one reason why no NATO state has ever seriously challenged the Montreux regime, even when individual provisions disadvantaged Western allies in particular scenarios. The constraint cuts in all directions. The Montreux Convention has survived for 90 years because every major party with the capability to challenge it has decided not to. Russia has reason to dislike specific provisions, particularly the tonnage and time limits on non-Black Sea warships that benefit Russia and harm potential adversaries. But Russia gets free passage for its own Black Sea-flagged vessels in peacetime and structural protection from large NATO naval deployments in wartime. NATO has reason to dislike Article 19's belligerent restrictions that would constrain a NATO response. But NATO gets the security of knowing Russia cannot freely deploy its Mediterranean force during conflicts. Turkey holds the rulebook. Turkey enforces it. The major powers have decided the rulebook is more useful than the alternative. Erdogan's government has proposed alternatives, primarily the Kanal Istanbul project, a man-made shipping canal parallel to the Bosphorus that would, by Turkish argument, fall outside Montreux's jurisdiction. The canal has been in planning for over a decade, with Erdogan describing it as a way to relieve congestion in the Bosphorus and generate transit revenue. Critics argue the actual motivation is to construct a Montreux workaround, a waterway through which warships could potentially transit without being subject to the convention's restrictions. As of 2026, the canal remains in early construction. Turkish authorities have stated the canal's traffic would not be governed by Montreux. Other parties to the convention dispute this interpretation. The legal question is unresolved. Turkey's diplomatic position over 90 years has been to enforce Montreux strictly enough that no party has felt the need to formally challenge it, while preserving enough discretion that the treaty serves Turkey's own interests. The geography gave Turkey the gate. The treaty gave Turkey the rulebook. The diplomatic skill kept both functional through World War II, the Cold War, the post-Soviet period, the Syrian Civil War, and now the war in Ukraine. The Bosphorus did not become a choke point by accident. The geology that shaped the strait, a flooded river valley connecting the Black Sea basin to the Mediterranean, predates human navigation by millions of years. What changed was the value of the connection. As Black Sea trade and naval power grew, the strait became increasingly consequential. As maritime law evolved, the question of how to regulate transit became increasingly contested. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 addressed it temporarily. The Montreux Convention in 1936 addressed it durably. 90 years later, the durable solution is still in force, still functional, and still controlling the operational behavior of one of the world's largest navies. Geography put a city on a strait. Montreux gave Turkey the rulebook. Turkish statecraft has done the rest. The geography sets the constraint. The institution decides what happens inside it. This is the hinterland.